Hey guys, we are finally wrapping up my coverage of the Traitors US Season 2 with a player ranking, where I'll be ranking all 22 players from the season based on the games that they played during the season. And obviously, this was a fun process as I did this last year for Season 1, and obviously that generated a lot of controversy. But now I'm doing it again for this season, and obviously there are some pretty interesting placements here, but we'll get to those soon enough. But there are 22 players to talk about, and that's wasting more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 22, the player I believe played the worst game on the season is not the first boot, but a little bit later on, and here we have Max. And obviously Max is kind of looked at as pretty socially awkward and someone that never really built many bonds across the season. He's one of the only people that doesn't vote out Peppermint at the first banishment, and moving forward, he obviously causes people to get sus of him due to him walking in and out of rooms and him not really gelling well with the other players, to where he's a pretty consensus target by the time of the second roundtable. So in a lot of ways, I feel like he's someone that probably wasn't doing that well across the season given their lack of relationships and obviously their voting record not being ideal, to where he's here number 22. Now moving on to number 21, we have the first person voted out at a roundtable, and here we have Peppermint. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Peppermint kind of got a bad deal here, where a lot of the reason she's targeted is due to Trishelle being sus of her. And while she doesn't do herself many favors with her like slipping up, saying that her goal is to get at a traitor instead of a faithful, I do feel like in a lot of ways, she didn't do as much actively wrong compared to Max. And I feel like had she gotten through this initial round, she probably could have had more potential in the game compared to Max. But obviously, she is taken out at the first opportunity, and while there weren't as many people sus on her compared to Max, I feel like they voted against her largely because they didn't have much information to go off otherwise. So I do feel like she gets unlucky that she is targeted so early on in the game and doesn't really have much of a chance to respond to it, and that's a big reason that I do have her here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, we have the formal first boot of the season, and here we have Johnny Bananas. And really there isn't much to say about Bananas. I mean, he was pretty much just there the first day, and he's pretty much just murdered as a way of making big waves right at the bat, which is a bit unlucky on his end, especially considering that he had like relationships with the other like people from Challenge and Survivor on there. So I do think he gets a bit unlucky in that regard, but really there isn't much to say about Bananas' game, both good or bad, to where he's just kind of here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19, we have the next murder on the board, and here we have Marcus. And to be fair, I don't think Marcus is the worst player in the world, where he did seem to be pretty intelligent coming into it, and I feel like had he been a traitor, he could have been an interesting one at that. But obviously he had a pretty big target on his back, not only from his relationship with Larsa, but also due to him coming off as his big threat, both in missions, but also in his intelligence and his ability to suss out the other traitors. So I feel like he was kind of sniped out of the game because of that. But again, with him being a pretty early boot and him not really getting to do much within the actual game, I did have to leave him here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, we have probably one of the tougher players to assess, and here we have Deontay. And Deontay feels like someone who probably wasn't primed to play a game like the Traitors, where obviously we saw him getting very upset after the max round, where obviously he felt bad about it, and that leads into him quitting the game. And supposedly afterwards we have learned that a lot of it stems back to his trauma and some mental health issues that he had. So again, it's very understandable why he ends up leaving the game here, though at the same time, he did seem to have some decent relationships in the house, where he did seem to be working with a lot of the gamers on the board. So I feel like had he stayed in the game, he probably could have been in it for a bit. However, I feel like with him like not really having the mindset to play a game with the Traitors, it's kind of hard to have him too much higher than here. But I still like Deontay, but as it is, I do have him here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and I feel like these next two are relatively close, but number 17, I did decide to go with Larsa, and Larsa's game is mostly messy, where right off the bat, she does immediately accuse Parvati of being a traitor, as she claims that she heard Alan tapping her shoulder, which paints a target on her back, where even if she was correct in Parvati being a traitor, she probably should not have called her out right off the bat, as it could have painted a target on her back. But even beyond that, we do see her like navigating the game with Marcus, her boyfriend, But yet, despite Marcus being murdered relatively early on, she's still being accused of being a traitor, which is kind of insane when you think about it, as why would she murder her own boyfriend? And while she kind of picks up the pieces later on by noting the alpha males being taken out and suspecting Dan of being a traitor, she's unable to convince most of the house to go along with her argument, and eventually she is taken out at the third round table. So in a lot of ways, I do find her game to be pretty mediocre, where, again, she probably should have had a pretty big advantage coming into the season. And while she does have the correct read later on, she's unable to convince really anyone of following along with her plans, and she is banished at the next roundtable despite her own boyfriend being taken out. So I feel like with that, along with other things, I did have her here number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another person that I'm kind of conflicted on, but I feel like this person has a bit of a wonky exit, and here we have Ekin Su. Now, again, I feel like Ekin Su's game is also pretty mediocre, where obviously she's targeted during the max round, and she has her feud with Janelle over the shield that kind of paints a target on their backs. And she is eventually suspected of being a traitor during the round where she is murdered, to where even if she had survived that murder, she probably would have been a bigger target coming into that next round table. So again, there's not a lot to really praise about her game. Really, the main reason I have her above Larsa is obviously her exit, where she wasn't even the initial target of the murder in plain sight twist, where Sheree was supposed to be murdered there until she just happened to be in the room when Parvati was handing out the chalice. Then also, I feel like she didn't make as many blatant mistakes as Larsa, like calling out Parvati at the initial traitor selection. So again, those things were just enough to have Ekin Su above Larsa for me at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Janelle. And Janelle is someone who obviously came into the season with a big target on her back, as she did across a lot of her Big Brother seasons. And while she is able to skate on by through a little bit of the game, we really see a lot of people suspecting her throughout a lot of the game, where she was obviously a suspect during the max round. And even beyond that, you have people like talking about her as this big traitor. But then you also have her acting in the missions, like where she would constantly gun for shields with obviously painted a target on her back as well. And while she did have people in the game willing to work with her, people like Dan and the other survivor people, I feel like by the time of her boot round, she was such a big target, and she doesn't do herself any favors either by targeting Dan, which took away any incentive that Dan had in wanting to work with her moving forward. And yes, while Dan was probably using her as a shield for down the road, it's still not particularly great that she was targeted so much during the season, and I feel like she doesn't really do much to really help her case. And while she had the backing of Peter's alliance during her boot round, I feel like they weren't really planning to keep her in the game for too much longer, as they really just saw Dan as being a traitor more so than seeing her as a faithful. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Janelle was pretty doomed within the game, but again, she did at least get a little bit in the game, which is why she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Tamara. And Tamara was just kind of there for a lot of the game. She didn't really weigh in too much in the actual gameplay and mostly just stuck with the housewives. And even then, she's murdered by Fedra, who is a fellow housewife there, despite that not even being in Fedra's best interest, and she really was just taken out as a way of creating confusion. And yes, while you could say that Fedra did this to avoid the sus being put on her bag, it's also bad that Tamara was just kind of expended in the game for that reason. But really beyond that, she doesn't really bring much to the table, though at the same time, she's never really suspected. I can't really say there are too many holes within Tamara's game, but again, she was just kind of expendable, which is why she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, we are finally at our first traitor on the board, and here we have Dan Giesling. And obviously I love Dan, he's obviously a fantastic Big Brother player, but he ends up playing a pretty rocky game across the season, where obviously he is immediately cast as a traitor, and while he does make the correct decision in recruiting Parvati, someone that is obviously like-minded to him, I do feel like he makes a number of pretty questionable decisions across the season, where right off the bat he ends up murdering Bananas, which I feel like is a bit of a misstep there, as Bananas seemed a bit more willing to work with him down the line. It was obviously a number for the Gamers Alliance. You also have him being very quiet for a lot of the season, not really building many game relationships, which while that was effective for him on Big Brother and him being under the radar, in the Traitors it just caused him to have sus put on him, where he wasn't really acting as a good faithful. And we see him being targeted for a lot of these roundtables, where obviously he is targeted during the max round, and obviously during the Janelle round, we have Janelle directly coming for him. You obviously have the whole Bergie situation where he completely falls into Peter's trap of him thinking that Peter had the shield and trying to murder Bergie, only for that to backfire. And at that point, he was pretty much screwed. And while I understand his logic of wanting to target Phaedra, as obviously Phaedra was less of a shield for him compared to Parvati, by that point he was pretty much screwed within the game, as obviously he had been targeted for a number of rounds, and with him like falling into this trap, it just made it so that he had no real shot of staying within the game. So on the whole, it was a pretty mediocre Traitor game, and it's for that reason that I have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we're actually jumping forward a bit in the boot order here, and here we have Kevin. And I feel like Kevin also played a pretty mediocre game for the most part, where yes, while he was part of Peter's alliance for a lot of it, I feel like it wasn't really that valued within that alliance, where while he had some people suspecting him of being a traitor early on, you even have his own allies admitting that he's a dumb faithful and someone that's just kind of meandering within the game. And while he does end up siding with Peter's group for a lot of the game and targeting Dan, Parvati, and later suspecting Phaedra, I feel like a lot of that stems from the fact that his own alliance was coming to those conclusions as well. And I feel like he doesn't really do that much detective work to figure that stuff out himself. And he's eventually just taken out as a way of weakening Peter's alliance further. So in a lot of ways, I do find Kevin's game here to be mostly mediocre, and it's for that reason that I have him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we probably have one of the toughest games on the board to look at here, and here we have Parvati, the next traitor on the board. And I think what's really hard about Parvati is, while it wasn't really highlighted as much in the show, it does seem like from exit interviews that she was suspected of being a traitor from very early on, and that kind of guided her throughout a lot of the game, where obviously she was seen as a traitor by a lot of the house, including by Peter's alliance later on. That causes this big target to be put on her back, and obviously that's made worse after Dan's blow up where he tries to murder Bergie, or obviously because she was one of the people that was told about this plan ahead of time, she was obviously put on the short list there. And while she is able to squeak her way a bit past Dan in the game, it was always in a spot where she was never actually going to win, as really everyone saw her as a traitor, and even if she had managed to get her way to the end, there was no way that anyone was going to vote to end the game with her still there. So yeah, that's obviously pretty bad on itself. But I will also say that I think Parvati played the game better than Dan, where I feel like there are points where Parvati is able to do some good work, such as paying a target on Peter's back when Peter's going for her, and there was going to be this plan to try to take out Peter before the safety chain kind of ruins things, but she's later able to make a deal with Peter to where Peter doesn't even vote for her at the round table she goes out in, so I do find that mildly impressive. And I think strategically, Parvati doesn't have as many faults compared to Dan, where I feel like she doesn't make as many mistakes within the game, but at the same time, she had a much bigger target on her back for more of the game compared to Dan, which obviously makes it all very hard to assess. But again, I was still kind of impressed by Parvati, even if she didn't really have much of a shot here, so because of that, she is here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, we have someone who makes it very deep into the game, but is also someone that doesn't really get much traction within the game at any point, but we do have MJ, who does get all the way to third place. However, if we look at the way that she got there, it is one where she's not really in the majority for a lot of it. Where while she does suspect Dan early on along with Larsa, she ends up voting incorrectly at each of the first 3 roundtables, where she votes for John during the Peppermint roundtable, votes for Dan during the Max roundtable, and she even votes for Kevin during the Larsa roundtable. And obviously losing Larsa very early on is pretty bad for her game, and she is kind of just dangling in the game for a lot of it, where she's not included in really any alliance for a lot of the game, where obviously she's being left out of the Peters group despite her seeming like a good fit for that, while not really being super well positioned outside of that. And as well, she is able to vote out a lot of the traitors along the way, voting out each of the traitors as they come up. She really gets towards the end of the game in a losing position where really there's no one that really wants to take her towards the end of the game, and she's kind of just dragged along because people know that she's a faithful and that she can easily be cut at the end, to where we get to the final 3, where even though they already voted out Kate and it's all faithfuls led, we see CT and Trishelle not even bother to take her to the end, where she ends up voting for Trishelle there. And while we do see Trishelle voting for CT in that 1-1-1 tie, she doesn't even bother to flip her vote to CT as a possibility of voting out CT there, squeaking her way to the final 2, and she is kind of voted out there as being pretty expendable. So in a lot of ways, I do find MJ's game here to be mostly mediocre, nothing really too crazy to praise, which is why she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we are finally back at another traitor, and here we have Fedra. And Fedra's game is also pretty interesting to look at here, where she does manage to go the longest without being targeted out of the initial traitors, where she is able to build pretty good social bonds during that. And obviously we see that come to fruition during the Dan round, where obviously Dan throws her under the bus trying to get her taken out, only for most of the votes to land on him instead. Though at the same time, that also is what allows a target to start to form on her back, where obviously from that point on, Trishelle does start to be onto her. Now, if we were looking at her game before that, she is mostly passive as a trader, where she's mostly letting Dan and Parvati do most of the legwork there. And even when she's given the choice to murder after the Larsa roundtable, she does make the wrong decision in murdering Tamara. Where while you could argue that murdering Tamara does lower her threat level by taking out a housewife, it also takes away a number for her that could work to her benefit later on in the game. And obviously, we do see that later on, where while she is able to get through the Parvati and Peter rounds all right, she obviously comes very close to being taken out at the Phaedra round. And at the point where Peter is revealed to be a faithful, she really is the biggest target on the board, to where we even get to her own roundtable. She doesn't even fight to stay. She doesn't even throw out names there, which in a lot of ways is similar to the flaw that Dan had, where obviously she doesn't really talk much game. She doesn't really help to figure out any traitors to that regard. So obviously all that's pretty bad. And I do feel like at the end of the day, she is a mostly passive traitor within the game. So obviously that's a pretty big fault on its own. But the fact that she is able to outlast the likes of Dan and Parvati and is able to keep the target off her back for more of the game was enough to have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, we actually have the final traitor left on the board, and here we have Kate. And obviously Kate's game is hard to assess, as she really only played half the season, coming in halfway through, and she's eventually recruited as a traitor, kind of because she has to. And I don't think she plays particularly well for a lot of the season. She is kind of passive during a lot of it. Though I will say the main thing I will give her a bit of credit for is painting a target on Sandra's back, and obviously getting CT to vote out Sandra at the final 5 round table. And even though that was probably a short-term strategy, as really she had no shot of actually winning the game, where obviously after it's revealed that Sandra is a faithful, it really just painted a massive bullseye on Kate's back, and she doesn't really help things either, where she is the only person to vote to end the game in a spot where everyone voted to continue, and obviously that leads to her being voted out pretty unceremoniously by the end of it. And obviously, I feel like Kate's game is kind of mediocre as well. But again, the fact that she was at least able to survive one round deeper than she probably should have, and taking out Sandra was enough to have her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, we have someone who I wasn't expecting to be this high, but they obviously made a pretty deep run. And here we have John Burkow. And again, John coming to the season was a pretty big anomaly here, being a former politician. And obviously he does have an initial target on his back due to his heavy breathing and him being this politician. And while he is able to get around that by swearing on his family, which wasn't shown on the show, he is able to convince people that he's a faithful. And from that point on, he does have a decent amount of longevity here. He is able to join Peter's alliance and is able to be pretty trusted within that group, and is able to suss out a lot of the traitors to that end. I do find John's game as a whole to be a bit more impressive compared to Kevin's, as I feel like John was a bit more involved in the actual decision making for that group. But obviously, by the time of his eventual boot, his group just didn't have the numbers anymore. Peter had just been banished. And obviously, with him being attached to Peter, he's obviously murdered there. So in a lot of ways, he kind of ran out of runway by the end of it. But I do find his game here to be surprisingly impressive, considering his background, to where I do have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and I wasn't really sure what to do with this person either. But again, they do have a lot of longevity on the season. And here we have Sheree. And Sheree was kind of just there for a lot of the season as well, where obviously there were points in the season where she had a bit of an independent streak, where after voting up Peppermint and feeling bad for that, she does decide to vote for Janelle during the Max round and John during the Larsa round. Though really after that, she kind of just fades into the background for a bit. I feel like a major knock is that she was the initial target during the Murder in Plain Sight round, where obviously the traitors wanted to murder Sheree against Fader's wishes. However, she's able to avoid that situation and really just skates through a lot of the game, not really being much of a priority there. And we get to the eventual Phaedra round, where while it did seem at first that Phaedra might be able to stay, she kind of just falls victim to Phaedra not really fighting to stay at that point, to where even she flips her vote to take out Phaedra, only to then immediately be murdered afterwards, which is obviously not particularly great. There is actually a debate for her being lower on the list, But again, the fact that she at least made it to the finale, she made it to the final 6, which was enough to have her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, we do have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Bergie. Now obviously Bergie was taken out earlier than other people, and he obviously was targeted earlier in the game as well, where obviously he was planned to be murdered had he not gotten a shield, but obviously that was all part of a plan that caused Dan to be exposed. So obviously I don't fault him too much for that, especially with him knowing about this plan and being willing to go along with it, and obviously with him knowing that he had the shield by that point. But obviously he is working alongside Peter in the Alliance for a lot of the game. He's actually the second in command to that Alliance for a lot of the game. And I do find him to be one of the better detectives on the board, where obviously he recognized that people like Parvati and Dan were traitors from early on. So obviously I do give Bergie a lot of credit for that. And obviously with him being part of Peter's alliance, he does have a decent amount of agency during a lot of the game. But obviously by the time of the safety chain, he does get massively screwed over, where obviously the plan initially was to target Peter, but after Peter's given safety, and with him being one of only a few options to be murdered, he is kind of sniped out of the game because of that. So I do feel like that's also weighing into his placement on this power ranking. And so I do find Bergie on the whole to be one of the more impressive players on the season, but obviously he's still taken out relatively early, which is why he's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and there's definitely a debate for this person being lower on the list. However, I feel like this person still was a very active player within the game, and here we have Peter. And obviously Peter was definitely one of the biggest players across the season, where he was one of the biggest detectives in trying to take out people like Dan and Parvati, and was obviously responsible for creating a lot of the leftover alliance, where he was able to pull in a lot of the people not really within the gamer group or the housewife group, and sort of like control the game to that end. But obviously he was one of the earliest people to target Dan and Parvati, and he was able to come up with some pretty interesting plans to try to expose some traitors. Now, I will admit that his first plan of making it seem like he and Kevin had this like rivalry was probably not ideal, as I feel like it could have gotten him exposed and painted a bigger target on his back, but he's able to skate through that. I will give him a lot of credit for the plan to act like he had the shield so that Dan and Parvati would try to go after Bergie, only for that to backfire. I do feel like that was a mostly effective plan, and obviously it's a big reason that causes the target to fall on Dan the following round. Now after this, he does get a bit of lucky that the following round was a safety chain, where obviously there was a serious movement to take him out due to Parvati, but due to the safety chain, he is able to be given safety by John, so he's able to scrape through that. And then the following round, he does make a deal with Parvati to work with her in an effort to take out Phaedra, which obviously paints a lot of sus on him, as obviously he had previously been going so hard against Parvati for a lot of the season, only to back out of that, which obviously is a bit of a misread there, and obviously is a reflection of the flaw of him targeting Parvati so much, only to back out of that. And obviously that leads into him being taken out after Parvati in a 5-4 vote. So it's definitely an interesting game to look at, where he was obviously very active across a lot of the season, and he was the leader of this alliance that was controlling a lot of the detective work early on. It's just a question of whether he would have gotten to the end, and I've said this before, I don't think he would have gotten to the end even if he had gone to this round, where obviously by that point he was such a massive target on the board that he was pretty unlikely to get to the end. But it's the fact that he had this alliance to begin with, and also the fact that for the most part he was pretty good on his reads, that leads him to be relatively high in this list, to where he's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone pretty similar to Peter, but they were able to get deeper into the game, and here we have Sandra. And obviously Sandra ends up playing a somewhat impressive game as well, getting all the way to the final 5. And in a lot of ways, she was kind of similar to Peter in being this pretty active leader and trying to take out people. Now, at the same time, I do feel like a lot of her reads were probably worse compared to Peter's, where obviously she was part of the Peppermint train early on, which is obviously a bad look, was obviously part of the Max plan, which obviously was also not a correct read there. But at the same time, she was obviously aligned with not only the gamer group, the Survivor and Big Brother people, but she was also close to a lot of the Bravo people and was able to kind of ride the middle because of that. Now, even though she was very much leaning towards the gamer side by the end of it, to where she would leak out that they were suspecting CT, I do feel like she was able to navigate through more of the game without having as big of a target on her back compared to Peter. Now, obviously, she still had plenty of sus, and there were definitely people suspecting her of being a traitor for a lot of the game. But obviously, with other traitors being taken out, people like Dan, Parvati, and Phaedra, it definitely stayed her execution for more of the game compared to Peter. And I feel like there were fewer rounds where Sandra was in serious danger of actually going home compared to Peter, which is obviously something I'll give her the edge. But obviously, by the time of her boot round, she does play kind of poorly, where due to her leaking information and talking all sides, that does cause the vote to flip from Kate onto her, which is obviously pretty bad. And even if she had survived that round, I don't think she wins the game, where I feel like CT and Trishelle were always planning on taking each other to final two. So obviously, that is also an issue positioning wise. But I still feel like Sandra played a mostly impressive game, was able to get through a lot of the game, managing her relationships pretty well. And obviously, she had less sus on her for more of the game compared to Peter, which is a big reason I have her here at number three. Now, moving on to number two, and obviously, it is the two winners of the season, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number two, I did decide to go with CT. Now, CT was someone who, by the end of the season, I was higher on from an edge standpoint compared to Trishelle. But I feel like from a game standpoint, I feel like CT was more out of the loop for more of the game compared to Trishelle, where obviously he was someone that wasn't really included in Peter's alliance. He was obviously working more so with the gamers for a lot of it. But even then, like there were definitely points where he was being sussed, where obviously Larsa was coming after him, and other people were seeing him as being like this alpha male that could have been a traitor for a lot of the game. So I feel like that is a knock to his game to a degree. You also have him being a potential target at the final five, which isn't particularly great. So I do feel like CT was more out of the loop for more of the game compared to Trishelle, but it was obviously still one of the better detectives on the board. He was eventually able to figure out who the traitors were and was able to play in a way that allowed them to be taken out. So I do find that pretty impressive. And obviously, he does make sense why he eventually wins, but it's largely the fact that he was out of the loop for more of the game compared to Trishelle that leaves him here at number two. And now, at number one, the person I believe played the best game on the Traitors US Season 2 is Trishelle. And again, I feel like the main reason I have Trishelle over CT is she was in the majority for more of the game compared to CT, where obviously she was still part of that gamers group, but was able to later build a close relationship with a lot of Peter's group to where she is eventually included within that. Now, obviously, there are definitely things you can point out with Trichelle's game, like the fact that she was the main person gunning for Peppermint early on, which caused her to look like an idiot, but at the same time, it also caused her to be seen as a faithful, where the fact that she was so willing to throw out a name early on was definitely a sign that she wasn't playing the game like a traitor. So again, that's sort of a give or take. You also have her decision at the end to vote for CT in a spot where MJ had voted for her, so in a revote, CT could easily have flipped on her, sending her out in a 2-1 vote. So again, I do find that decision to be pretty wonky. But for the most part, I do find Trichelle's game to be most impressive, where she was one of the main people going for Phaedra for a lot of the season. And with her working alongside Peter's alliance, she was one of the people that was gunning for like a lot of the people in the Traitors group. And yes, while she does stumble at points, like failing to save Peter during that round, she is eventually able to get to the end of the game with CT, which was her plan from the start. So again, it is a mostly impressive game. She was able to play pretty well for the most part, and I feel like with her being in the majority for more of the game compared to CT, that does leave her here at number one. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of the Traitors US Season 2. Now obviously I have other shows going on as well, such as Survivor 46, Australian Survivor, and Big Brother Canada, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.